So let's just start with resilience, this sort of idea of resilience, how we're seeing it everywhere right now and in the last couple of years. This is cool how many of you have your cameras on, by the way. That doesn't happen over here. It's nice to see you. Hey, everyone, in your dorms or your rooms, wherever you are. So resilience is this word that we hear everywhere, constantly, all the time, and especially during the pandemic, we've heard it. We've heard it in the context of the need for people to build personal resilience. And so here, this is just one of the many website guides to how families and staff at various, jobs can build their own personal resilience during the COVID-19 outbreak so that they can, in terms of their mental health, their psychological well-being, even their physical well-being, deal with the, very profound disruptions and questions and, fears and, things that have happened over the last 3 years now, 2.5 years now. The idea that you, an individual, need to work on yourself to deal with the sort of turbulence that the systems are bringing to us is one way in which we have seen resilience quite often. And a lot of jobs, people are getting emails like this from the, sort of higher up administration with some suggestions of how to build their resilience, right? We also see resilience in the sort of realm of corporations and employers trying to maintain their own resilience, right? So this is an image of a sign that you see here in Georgia, where I live right now. I relocated here during the pandemic for a job, and any business you go into, any restaurant, any store, any job where you're going into work, this sign is on the door saying, this corporation, this entity is not responsible for your death from COVID if you come in here. And, a big, driver of so many of the experiences that we have had over the last couple of years has been the need for corporations and employers to maintain their, profits and their financial well-being by staying open, whatever the cost, or changing the way that they're open so that they can, continue to, bring in profit despite the things that are going on around them. We have also seen resilience being sort of the watchword and the bottom line in the realm of governments, states, and militaries in the pandemic. And this is just this little early on in the pandemic operation called Operation Resilience in France. The French military, this is the term that they used to describe their, sort of expanded powers for the military to support the pandemic mobilization over there. So the idea being that, that the state itself would be resilient and use its, existing institutions to be resilient to what the pandemic would bring. So we see resilience kind of talked about very often. I'm sure all of you have in one way or another been encouraged to be more resilient or given instructions on how you could be more resilient yourself, to all the stresses you're experiencing, to the anxiety you may be experiencing, to the anger you may be experiencing, whatever it is, right? We hear it all the time, but we don't always think about where the term comes from because it wasn't always so ubiquitous. Resilience is a term that comes from resilience ecology and the study and management of ecosystems. Historically, in the 1970s, it was a term that really got sort of built and conceptualized by an ecologist named C.S. Halling, who was working on questions of environmental and ecosystem management. And he was studying the way in which ecosystem managers would tend to try to keep a system, whether we're talking about a pond or a forest or what have you, in the same state that it had been in. So to try to stop change, to try to block disturbance, right? The ecosystem would then stay in its sort of stability state. And that was the dominant approach to ecosystem management up until Halling made this intervention. Halling said, though, actually, there is another way that we can manage ecosystems, and then he would later say any system, which is by adaptive management and resilience building. So resilience, as it is typically defined here, is the capacity of a social ecological system, or really any system, to absorb or withstand perturbations or other stressors such that the system remains within the same regime essentially maintaining its structure and functions. So let's put that in other words. Resilience tends to be understood as the ability to absorb stress or crisis and maintain systems as they are, right? So a system could be a government, a system could be a city, a system could be a pond ecosystem, it doesn't matter. But resilience is the idea that instead of, blocking those crises and those disturbance events, you allow them to happen. You actually understand that they are natural. This is according to the resilience thinking, right? You understand that these events and these disturbances are natural, and you build in capacities within your system so that the system can survive throughout that kind of stress and crisis, right? So it can either bounce back or bounce forward by recalibrating a little bit, but not changing its essential identity, right? So for me, I've studied resilience in the realm of climate change, adaptation, and governance in cities. So for me, that's where I really look at it. But there is a whole set of thinking on resilience in psychology, in the military, and in many different fields. For me, though, what I have studied is the way in which resilience has come to be the very, very dominant sort of not only buzzword, but methodology used by urban planners and governments and designers in order to manage cities and urban systems amidst the disruptions of climate change. So specifically things like hurricanes, and that's what you see here in this picture. This was Hurricane Harvey, which in 2017 hit Houston, among other places, and caused massive, massive flooding due to just dumping historically unprecedented amounts of rain over the city, which is built, of a lot of non-porous concrete and so on. In the realm of urban resilience, it's the approach is used by designers and planners to try to build the capacity to absorb events like this, like stronger hurricanes, big precipitation events, and things like that. And it really around the beginning of the 2010s replaced sustainability as the approach that was kind of dominant. And this is something that we could talk about in and of itself for a very long time. It's something that has, ecologists and designers and even urban planners very, very upset, because they're like, sustainability at least implied you were trying to make things better, you were trying to improve things, but resilience for a lot of them is, it's essentially about keeping things the way that they are, despite disaster all around us. So we see resilience being used to describe a lot of the way people are responding to these disasters that we're seeing more and more with climate change, like Harvey. And so here, this is a picture of the Cajun Navy, which is a grassroots self-organized response and recovery network in the Gulf Coast region here in the United States. They go out, they use their boats, they use, apps to coordinate their efforts to help people who aren't being helped by the state or by, these existing aid agencies. So there's this sort of, expectation you hear now, which is a very neoliberal, expectation that people themselves should be able to, do disaster relief, take care of each other and themselves, rather than waiting for, the federal government or the official relief agencies. So this sort of, again, this echoing of this personal resilience expectation that we hear a lot, and calls for personal resilience, as with COVID, right? How can you, individuals and communities, get more prepared to weather this new normal of increasingly frequent extreme events? In the Gulf Coast, we have seen hurricanes just slamming places like southern Louisiana repeatedly in the last couple of years. So it's not only that storms are getting stronger, but we're seeing more of them hitting the same place over and over, which becomes it becomes much harder to respond when you just responded a year ago, right? And this is part of this sort of new normal of climate change that we're already seeing here. And it's had a really sharp uptick in the last couple of years as well, at least in the United States. Well, resilience is also, and I'd say primarily in its governmental sort of usage, a matter of protecting large-scale infrastructural systems, economies, electrical grids, transportation networks, communication networks. It's very much about critical infrastructure protection. How do you build and redesign infrastructures so that the existing economies, the existing systems of work in cities like New York, which you see pictured here, can keep going throughout disasters, throughout these sort of extreme disruptions, which, as you can see in this picture here, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012, that was a long time ago now. You probably may not even remember that. But when it did, this was a really big sort of turning point for urban planning and thinking about adaptation, because it really rocked the city of New York, which, had been thought quite relatively speaking, powerful and invincible prior to this moment. Here you saw a blackout throughout much of Manhattan, one of the most powerful cities in the world, in blackout because of the storm. So there has been a real increase in thinking about, like, how do you protect these economic powerhouses, these infrastructures, and so on from the disasters that are generated by this industrial capitalist system that we live in. The other area of resilience that is important to kind of note is that it's not just about building the capacity to absorb and deal with these extreme punctuated events like a hurricane, a storm that comes, infrequently, right? It's also about how do you absorb the larger scale, longer term transformations of climate change itself, and stop them from disrupting basic urban systems. So these are some pictures from Miami, Florida, where I was living until recently and doing a lot of research. And Miami is a place that's already experiencing sort of ongoing flooding during high tide events from sea level rise. So this being from the melting of the ice and the warming of the earth, the rising of the seas. Miami is a place where this is happening earlier than many other places, and in a way that's more difficult to deal with, because it's coming up through the porous surface that the city's built on, rather than just from over the seawalls or the coasts, right? So the question in a city like Miami, as with so many cities in the world, is, how can you design infrastructures able to field and absorb and manage this environmental change, this radically transformative environmental change, so that the city keeps going, so that the real estate markets keep going, so that the investor confidence stays up, and so on. So resilience is a concept and a management approach that comes, like I said, from resilience ecology, and it's tied to this idea of the adaptive cycle and the back loop, which I'll kind of explain here. So this is a diagram created by C.S. Halling, who I mentioned was the originator of the idea of resilience, right? But it is used widely within resilience ecology to describe the different phases that any system goes through in its sort of existence, right? So for a resilience ecologist, everything in the world is understood as a system, whether that's your life as an individual, a city as a social ecological system, a forest, what have you. Everything in the world is a system, right? And everything that is a system, according to resilience ecology, goes through two sort of main phases of its life, a front loop and a back loop. And so this diagram is depicting that set of phases. So in the foreground there, where you see the lines kind of going from that phase of exploitation up to conservation, that's what they call the back loop. And I'm sorry, the front loop, and the exploitation to conservation, that line that's in the front of this sort of infinity loop is the front loop. Historically, for resilience ecologists, that was all they imagined was that a system went through. So you went through this early phase of sort of, early exploitation of resources or coming together of an ecosystem, up to the phase of sort of stability, where the relationship between predator and prey and so on in a system are sort of in their place. Right. So if you've ever been, hiking in a forest, an older forest, and you see very tall trees overhead, not much sunlight is reaching the ground below. You have certain kinds of plants that can survive in that environment, certain that cannot, and so on and so forth. A mature forest would be an example of what ecologists thought a sort of stable state system was like. So the front loop is sort of this like progression up into that stable state, right, where everything is supposedly, seen as in its place. Historically, conservation was about maintaining a system in that state. So you wouldn't want change to occur, or at least radical disruption to occur. So you would try to maintain those parameters and those ecological relationships and so on. But Holling's intervention and the intervention of resilience thinking was to say that no, actually systems go through a second phase, the back loop. And so that line that you see in the background of the loop here that goes from release to reorganization, that's a little bit more shaded in the back there, that represents the back loop of a system. A back loop is a time when those relationships that made up the system in its seemingly stable state come undone. They break down, they come apart, they are released. This is a phase that can be inaugurated by a punctuated crisis, or by long-term transformations and instabilities and changes and things like that. It can be either one. When a system enters a back loop, it goes into a state that is less stable. It is more disorganized. It is a time of sometimes confusion, sometimes release, sometimes disarray, right? It's also a time, and this is what resilience ecologists emphasize, it's also a time for reorganization. It's a time where they emphasize you need to experiment, try new things, because new trajectories and new relationships are possible, right? So resilience is just sort of one way of thinking about what do you do with a system when it's entered into a back loop, right? If a system is entered into a back loop, one thing you can do is try to keep it in its, basic identity, maintain that loop. So when you get there back in that reorganization phase, see how the arrows kind of point right back into the loop. So it would be sort of an infinity loop. That would be a resiliency approach. You don't want the system to break down. You want to keep it in that stable state. So you try forms of recalibrating your organization, the ecosystem, what have you, so that it does not lose its basic identity. All right. Resilience has seen a lot of criticism as an approach to dealing with things like climate change, the Anthropocene, the problems of our world right now. And if you kind of look at the way things are going, these are just two quick diagrams to show you kind of the trajectories in two major trends over the last several decades. One of those being the rise in global temperature change and atmospheric carbon dioxide being released, and the increase in billionaire wealth, right? If you see what the normal course of things, right, looks like in our societies right now, you might think to yourself, maybe resiliency isn't exactly what we need. It's not maybe the only approach that we need to just salvage and maintain and, secure the existing systems. Maybe something more is needed, right? When resilience ecologists like C.S. Halling talk about a back loop, what they emphasize, and I think this is very important for us, stepping back from, the specifics of that diagram or the specifics of resilience ecology itself. What they emphasize is that when you're in a back loop, you need to recognize that you're moving into regimes of the unknown, of the literally unknown. What they mean by that is that a lot becomes possible and that old methods aren't necessarily relevant anymore, right? That you need to try new things because you're in a new situation, right? Rather than just doing what you've been doing over and over and over again, it's time to innovate and experiment and try something radically different. In my own work, I have thought that this concept of the back loop was an immensely helpful lens through which to see the world that we're living in right now, in terms of what we call the Anthropocene, in terms of climate change, and in which the grounds beneath our feet are literally changing concretely, but also, if we think about this, metaphysically or philosophically, the forms that we have relied on, the forms of thought, the forms of understanding what it means to do politics, to act in the world, are literally just being scrambled right now. And I think we see that across our society in so many different ways. It is a time of great upheaval in the social world, and the political world, and the economic world, as well as the environmental world. For me, the Anthropocene, when it first started to be discussed, was a very useful word, because I thought, at least to me, it seemed to encompass that breakdown of so many different systems, social, political, environmental, and so on, at the same time. And it seemed to call so much for just this radical transformation in all those domains. And so for me, it was a very, I thought, powerful term that could help us think such a large scale moment of upheaval at once, right? The back loop, I think, also helps us refine that understanding. So for me, I find it very useful to think about the time that we are in historically as a back loop with, sort of a broad civilizational back loop, but also one that is manifesting in very different ways at the local level in all of our lives, right? And I know you guys are experiencing that in some ways with the strike and the Brexit and the responses to COVID and there are all these different manifestations of other back loops, right? So I think we're living in this multi-scalar back loop as a civilization. So I think that it's quite useful then to look at what resilience ecologists say about a back loop. If we are trying to think about, well, how to live and what to do in the back loop that we are in ourselves. So, the first thing is to recognize that this is a time of the unknown, the literally unknown. So we're in a historically new moment. Let's act accordingly. Resilience is one way of responding, trying to maintain existing systems despite the fact that they're breaking down and maybe they're completely ineffective, right? That's one response. And we see that as a dominant response. It may be that a smaller scale back loop, one might really want to maintain a system that one is in, if it was not a disastrous system. That makes a lot of sense. So it depends, resilience in what system and toward what end and by whom, right? That's a question you can always, I think, ask. Transformation is another possible response to a back loop. And this is something increasingly talked about a lot by resilience ecologists themselves, who are very frustrated by seeing the way that the concept of resilience has become another word for maintaining the status quo, right? They actually, a lot of them don't want that. And so for them, they started to talk a lot about transformation as a technical term even. How do you get out of that loop rather than staying in it? So if you look on that left-hand side, there's that X, right? That little pathway out, that arrow out. Transformation is represented by that X. And I always find that a very compelling, like, what's going on with that X? How do we make that X real? Again, it's an X, it's an unknown. We don't know what that looks like, right? We don't know what it would mean to get out of the loop at all. It would be something that would have to be tried in reality. So a regime shift or transformation. Sometimes there can be a forced transformation, right? And that's another thing that I'll talk about in just a second, right? Rather than a popular transformation. That could be another response to a back loop. We are, I think, at this point, very familiar with this idea of the shock doctrine. This is Naomi Klein's word, this idea that corporations or governments or what have you are well accustomed to using moments of crisis to implement changes or transformations that benefit them, right? Whether that's for profit or opening up new markets or what have you. Another possibility for a back loop is that there is no dominant response, right? And there's just confusion and chaos. And if we look around, sometimes it feels like that's where we are also, right? There are a lot of different things that can be going on all at the same time. One thing that resilience ecologists also emphasize is that surprise, novelty, unexpected synergies, unexpected new connections or relationships become much more possible in a back loop. And that's because those dynamics, those systems, and those models that sort of sedimented the front loop systems are coming undone. And when that happens, I think, as we all know from our own life experiences, it can be disastrous, but can also open a lot of possibilities, right? That maybe were latent, but that we couldn't touch before, right? Halling sums it up. He says, during a back loop, uncertainty is high, control is weakened and confused, and unpredictability is great. So the key thing to do is not to just rehash old models, but to experiment with new ones. So kind of stepping back from resilience ecology and all that for a second, I just want to talk a little bit about how, the fortunes and misfortunes of the idea of resilience in recent years. It's been so dominant. It has been everywhere, and we are being told to be resilient all the time. And there's been an increasing, sort of resistance to resilience. People saying, I am so sick of being told to be resilient. I am exhausted by being resilient. the multiple pressures of your employer, your government, your, bank, everybody, your student loan debt collector telling you to find ways of being resilient, right? It can be exhausting. This is an Instagram post from a pretty popular account in Louisiana. It's about all things kind of Louisiana culture and so on. And this was posted right after Hurricane Ida hit the Louisiana coast last year, which was, not the first hurricane to hit in the last few years. And people were just so sick of rebuilding and being told by governments and politicians that they were so brave for, once again, responding to the disaster themselves and so on, right? While nothing is being done about climate change and so on, and relief isn't being provided to people. They're saying, everybody likes to brag about the people of Louisiana, saying, oh, look how resilient they are, and just putting them, as the headline, right? But they're like, we don't want to be resilient. We want to live in a world where we don't have to be resilient, right? To the disasters that the institutions around us create. And I think what's interesting is if we look at the pandemic, back to that again, right? There has been a massive exhaustion and refusal to be resilient in some ways, at least in the United States. We have had a kind of incredible phenomenon develop over the last year or so, which is sometimes referred to as the great refusal or the great resignation, where we are just seeing massive record numbers of Americans quitting their job. More than 4 million Americans have quit their jobs every month for the last 6 months. That is an incredible number. It's by far the highest number of people quitting their jobs since these kinds of statistics were since they started to keep these kinds of statistics. That's I think, let's see, I wrote down some numbers just to make sure I had the updated ones. This year, more than 35 million people have quit their jobs. Since April, I think it was about 1 in 4 workers who had quit their jobs. So that really kind of puts these numbers in perspective. And this has created massive labor shortages for employers. And you have seen this, I've seen it where I live, all around. There are a lot of stores who are closed due to lack of workers, with signs like this at Burger King. You'll also see, signs up saying sort of like, excuse our slow service. The workers who did show up are doing their best, stuff like this. Or you're seeing in the places where they are still open, workers are being asked to work or made to work double shifts, nonstop, which is further aggravating the thing that is actually probably driving this in many ways, which is the fact that people are exhausted. They're fed up with the conditions of their jobs, the low pay, the disrespect in many cases that they're experiencing, the fact that they can't be with their families, the COVID context, all this stuff. And in a lot of ways are just people are saying, I'm tired of being resilient in the terms that it's being asked for. So, I think there's a lot of ways you could interpret this, and it's still sort of like very mysterious phenomenon. Because it's not happening as a strike. It's not happening as some collective, organized, labor movement, right? Like in the past or something like that. There isn't a set of, statements or manifestos or something like this, right? There's the anti-work Reddit, where a lot of people just like tons and tons and tons of people share their stories of quitting online and like cheer each other on and things like that. And that's sort of this weird social space that this is connected to, but by and large, it's this just sort of, dispersed event of people acting on their own experiences and their own feelings. But it's a strong sense of being tired with resilience. One way you might interpret it, the very like hopeful, starry-eyed reading is, this is the beginning of a great general strike. The massive movement of people that would finally sort of, break this loop in which, life is caught in capitalist society and so on, this historic, moment of transformation, right? And liberation or not, right? A very dark reading is this is a sort of turning inward towards screens, things like that. or there's something in between. It's very hard to say, and there's no one explanation. But I think this is a different response to these upheavals of the last several years, and to resilience in general. People are exhausted. When the pandemic started in 2020, I read a very beautiful text online. I don't know where it came from, but it was called "What the Virus Said," and it was written as if the coronavirus itself had issued a statement, right? And it said, "I've come to shut down the machine whose emergency brake you couldn't find." And this was sort of describing this idea that that the pandemic would be this moment where everything had to stop so that people could think, so that people could reflect and change everything, right? So very sort of hopeful kind of little piece, right? And there's so many ways in which for a moment there at the beginning of all this, when people were home more or not having to go into work as much and things like this, for a moment, it was as if, being appeared to us right in front of us. It was like a very Heideggerian moment. It was this very incredible moment where you could look at existence for a second and think, oh my God, what are we doing? This everything has to change. Look at how broken this is. Look at what our priorities have been, this sort of moment, right? And it could have, I think it still is for a lot of people, a moment like that, a moment of opportunity for deep change. But what's, very interesting is that again, back to resilience, capitalism is great at crisis events. It's great at using crisis events to transform and recalibrate its own systems, to, internalize critique, to make changes so that it thrives and moves forward. Corporations are great at this. Governments are great at this. And so there has been, this is a tweet from a member of the White House dealing with national economic issues. And he is, kind of expressing for the president, Joe Biden, that the great resignation I was just describing is a great thing, right? It's the great upgrade. And, it will be this sort of, self recalibrating movement. So this is sort of this, attempt to kind of co-opt that energy, right? And draw it into sort of a political support. And then we have seen a lot of different instances in which the pandemic and the disruptions of it and the breakdowns of various systems are being sort of seen as a moment for reimagining, reflecting, and resetting global governance, global economic systems, and so on. So the name, the Great Reset, I'm sure everyone is familiar with this term. It was the name of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which was held in the summer of 2020. That brought together, businesses and politicians to think about how to rebuild and recalibrate the economy and society and technology, right, after the pandemic. And this very much in many ways reflects the same, at least words used by resilience ecologists to think about what do you do during a back loop, right? And, of course, this has led to a lot of conspiracy theories. And this, to be very clear, is just like some crazy post from a crazy person on Facebook. But, the Great Reset, it's like a QAnon conspiracy theory that the pandemic was, planned and invented, and just as an opportunity to institute like the new world order government, right? And so on. You see a lot of stuff like this online about the Great Reset. But the thing is, these conspiracy theories are silly because you don't even need them. You don't even need them because we see historically and in the present how during these moments of disruption, this is a time when power recalibrates. It is a time when governments recalibrate, and you don't need a conspiracy to understand that. It's just how, they understand the lessons of back loops and they act accordingly. We have seen, the massive increase in billionaire wealth since the pandemic started. That's just one example of, how it has been a very, profitable situation for the very wealthy. It's also been a situation where there have been a lot of attempts to kind of recalibrate things at the levels of governments and economics. This is a picture of the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez. And he's been trying to sort of inaugurate a different kind of back loop recalibration at the level of the city of Miami. He's been trying to make it into sort of the new Silicon Valley, a tech and cryptocurrency capital. And he's been really trying to bring in, financial businesses, finance, and tech companies to Miami. And you've had, Peter Thiel and these very, very, very wealthy people buying, homes in Miami because he's used it as this sort of branding of it's a great place to work remotely since everyone is working remotely. You have palm trees behind you and your Zoom background and they're not fake, right? This whole idea that you could come to Miami and do your tech work there. And he's been trying to make it into a cryptocurrency capital and even to recalibrate what urban government looks like by bringing crypto into urban governance, allowing you to get your municipal paycheck in crypto, having himself paid in it, and actually in the process, just actually trying to create a new market for certain cryptocurrencies in Miami. And, Miami is a city built on scams. And this is just another amazing example of this, these sort of hype men and, all that, but it has produced real world effects where the city of Miami now is like by far the most unaffordable housing market in the entire country here. It's just the housing costs have just skyrocketed with this speculation there. So this is one of these sort of moments where, there's been a harnessing of a back loop that has produced very, very negative effects for ordinary people living in Miami. So I think I've been talking for a while, and I think the more interesting thing for everyone would be to have a chance to talk together. So I'll wrap it up here. These are hopefully just some thoughts to give us more to talk about, right? Rather than offering answers or anything like that. But I did want to just conclude, right, with some thoughts about the back loop and what responses can look like to it, right? And this is a meme that, went around a lot during the last year about COVID. And there's lots of memes like this, kind of expresses these, just the madness with resilience that I think a lot of people feel. The last several years, I think, have revealed a lot. They have revealed so much about the sort of brutal cynicism of employers in many cases, the expectations that they place upon workers, companies and governments, what the bottom line of profit looks like, even in a situation where people are dying all around you. In many cases, the loss of credibility of expert narratives, of expert institutions at a wide scale across society. It's been a time where, in some ways, though, for those of us who were lucky, that we had a brief window where maybe we were home more than we would have been before. For a lot of us, that meant being able to spend time with our families in a way that we would never have been able to before because of work. For me, that was the case. And it was an incredible thing to have that time, because it's amazing. You don't need to read Capital. You don't need to read Marx to see how much of our life goes to work and how much we lose of our lives sometimes in that temporality. And I think these last years really put that in front of our faces at a wide scale around the world. And there was a moment where, you had to ask yourself, what do I prioritize? What matters? What should human life be? Right. And you start to question, what are the priorities that are, governing our world, right? And the various institutions that we're a part of. And I think that question, being able to ask oneself that, maybe for the very first time, it's a real luxury to get to ask yourself, like, what your priorities are and how you're going to shape your life accordingly. I think that the opportunity to get to ask that question for once is part of what has led to that great resignation, the mass quitting of work that we're seeing, at least in America. But it could also lead to a lot more. And I think that, if we take seriously the idea that we're in a back loop as a society, as a civilization, a back loop that involves the basic parameters of how we think, how we act, what is possible, as well as the ground that we stand on, the rising of the oceans, and so on. we take that really seriously, then it opens up the possibility of reconsidering a lot more than we have so far. Not just, how do we make it through this crisis so we can get back to work tomorrow? And not just how do we shoulder another stressor so that, billionaires make more money, right, or whatever. But how do we actually experiment and innovate and try new things that might actually open up that X that we saw in that diagram of the back loop, right? That might open up exit routes out of this sort of infinity loop that we are caught in, and open up other futures for ourselves and for each other and for the people who will also be coming. So I think that, really, really coming back to this idea that a back loop is a time to experiment and to try new things and to really open up new doors, I think is a very valuable lesson from resilience ecology that we might want to consider in our own lives and in our own places, wherever we're doing what we're doing. Because the exit out of the back loop or out of the sort of infinity loop there isn't going to look the same, right, for everybody, because we are all in different places trying to figure out different things, right? There are many possible exit routes, but I think it will probably take all of them to get out. So I'll leave it there. Those are just some thoughts that we can maybe discuss. If you have questions, comments, I hope we have a good amount of time for that now. So thank you.
Wow, great, thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. I haven't been looking at the chat. I think Maria's here. Are they people already wanting to ask questions, or should I?
Nobody seems to have their hand up right now.
Okay, all right. So if you do want to ask Stephanie other questions to follow on or explain what she was talking about, then just indicate that to Maria. You don't need to write the question out. Just put a little thing in the box so she can follow through. So I'm going to spotlight Stephanie. So you're the star of the show. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and just to kind of start the conversation going. The point you ended up seemed to answer the first one that I had in mind as you're talking. That from your description, it feels like we're in many back loops simultaneously. So it's the back loop of essentially coming to the end, or a kind of breakdown in the neoliberal order that has dominated the planet for the last 40 years or so, certainly the last 20 years. That seems to be kind of falling to bits. And you've got institutional breakdowns, which is what we're going through at Goldsmiths. You've got the COVID brought another kind of breakdown of the kind of the supposed adequacy of things like healthcare systems, social security, and so on in the places that had them, because lots of places didn't. But they kind of continued functioning, and that all seemed okay enough for people to not sort of revolt against it. But then COVID kind of like jammed that up, and then there was huge support from states, suddenly found trillions of dollars that were previously unimaginable to keep things going or to return back to where things were, which I think is where we are now, certainly in the UK. Not everywhere, but in the UK, and I think in the States as well. You've also got the back loop of climate breakdown, because it's too late to kind of think about keeping the planet as it was environmentally in terms of ecosystems. So the issue isn't kind of whether we're in the back loop. The issue is like, where does the back loop go? And in the end, you've got the diagram, the little X thing that leads off and sort of like spurts out all these kind of other possibilities and futures which don't belong to the historical systems. But you've also got a bunch of people like the billionaires, like a lot of the efforts from rich governments, certainly, and I think most governments, to make sure that things return back to where they were before COVID, which again is like neoliberalism and so on. So the kind of large question is, the examples you gave were examples that kind of, they seem quite complex to me. So the billionaires you mentioned seem to be quite happy to, and the example of the mayor of Miami seems quite happy to trash the historical model of what Miami has been, to bring in these kind of new like billionaire tech bros, basically, and have Miami as a kind of background or a kind of playground for the tech bros. And in a way, that's a kind of exit from the history of Miami, for like these new actors, but at the same time, they're keeping billionaire accumulation going, which is like the front loop of neoliberalism, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get to is there's kind of a few kind of sub points to that. One would be around the examples you gave of people who can sort of do things with a back loop that serve them quite well are typically bad examples. They're bad actors. We understand them to be bad actors. I was wondering if you had any models of like good examples, good actors, maybe not necessarily to do with COVID, but from like your longer standing research around climate breakdown. Right? Because, and I think part of this is kind of what sort of model of collective action is there in the back loop? Because the notions of collectivity we have are historically formed, so they belong to the history that's breaking down. And if those things are breaking down, then we need to generate new forms of collectivity or new forms of like moral action, which don't correspond to the historical ones. And I'm wondering if there's something, say in Black Lives Matter, which proposes that the kind of reliance in the North Atlantic, the reliance on racism historically, that's not tenable anymore. It was never tenable, but now it can act against it very specifically. And there seems to be some kind of restructuring of what race means, both as a category, but also how it's implemented socioeconomically, which suggests that if Black Lives Matter is effective, and we hope it is, we can't go back to where things were. Right? So but there's a kind of organizational form in Black Lives Matter, which is transnational, it's very individuated, it's very collective, it kind of meets and then disperses. So there's something in that where, yeah, I'm kind of just looking for an example of like a good version of a back loop actor that can take us to more progressive events rather than like the tech bros win the day.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the question, right? That's the big question it should be the question of our lives, I think, to figure that out. And if there was an answer that I could give really, quickly and easily, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here, right? I mean,
that's pretty quick. We've got at least half an hour.
Well, if I could give it in half an hour, if it existed, period, maybe I wouldn't be here, because I think that you're so right? Obviously, what is striking is if you look around at what, the very wealthy are doing, what governments are doing, they're very comfortable with these kinds of back loop recalibrations and, throwing out the old methods and trying new things, move fast and break things, as the Facebook motto used to have it. They're very good at that. I think, and we see they're doing extreme forms of experimentation, including the idea of colonizing Mars, leaving the planet behind, trashing it and leaving it behind, all these types of things. It's they're good at it. The scales at which they do it are massive. The resources they mobilize, the freedom that they wield when they do it is great. If we look around at the rest of the world, at the rest of us, at ordinary people, that we find far less of that capacity and organization and so on. So I think it's instructive to study what the very powerful are doing, because it shows both the insufficiency of what exists to counter that, but also I think that there are lessons that can be learned, right? And so that's for me what's important in studying that at all in the first place. And so, yeah, so then the question is, well, what are the, the liberatory, models or whatever, right? I think that they remain to be invented. It's incredible. I mean, I think if we look at the last decade and a half or so, we have seen a massive uptick in uprisings around the world, riots, insurrections, social movements, even revolutions that have toppled governments in parts of the world. There has that, I think, too, is a characteristic of this back loop that we're in. There are these efforts to kind of break through, but more often than not, what we see is things get rerouted back to the systems that were there before. And this is a thing about a cybernetic governmental order. A cybernetic regime is very good at allowing disturbance, including uprisings, and then allowing it to flare up and then fade away, or reincorporating its energy. And we have certainly seen that in the wake of things like Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd rebellion and so on in America and around the world, the way that has provided great fodder for corporations to sort of try to internalize the critique and then keep moving, right? To neutralize the opposition that gets shown in those moments. That said, I mean, there has been such an incredible energy and in many cases organization evidenced in these uprisings. We might think from like Occupy Wall Street up to the present, up to the George Floyd rebellion or what have you, is the sequence of, to my mind, these are a sequence of Anthropocene rebellions and uprisings as well, that show the massive energy that wants to break out of this system and that is looking for its means to do so, right? And I think that question of what are those means and what are those forms of organization has to be at the forefront of discussion and experimentation. One of the major areas that I look at a lot and I think about a lot is infrastructure, because it seems such an obvious area in which organization is needed if there is any hope of these rebellions not just flaring up and fading away and we go back to everything the same the next day. There has to be the material means to make other ways of life live, right? There has to be the forms, not just the material forms, but yes, the material forms for food, water, communication, these basics of human life. Human societies, human cities, human communities have always had their own means of existence, to use a Marx-esque term, right? They've always had their own means of existence, and it's by recreating those and taking those into communities' own hands that I think that there's a great liberatory possibility. But that could go in any direction, because that logic applies to anybody trying to break out of the loop. I think that this search for infrastructural self-sufficiency or community in the big, wide sense, sufficiency, where you're not reliant on neoliberal systems is widespread. But the means are a very small scale. We see these experiments all the time around the United States. People are really interested in this stuff. That's why I think so many survival skills schools are so full. Their classes are always packed and waiting lists and so on. People are trying to figure out, trying to touch the means of life again, to reappropriate them. But often it's like the scale and the means and the resources are lacking. There's such a gap between what's needed and what people have. I mean, you're working at Burger King. How are we going to get together the massive means needed to make another way of life live? This is a question, that said, I mean, if people coordinate together, it's entirely possible. I think as an example of a very interesting area that's just kind of getting started, but in New Orleans and in the Louisiana Gulf Coast, there are a lot of people, indigenous communities of different backgrounds, French-speaking Louisianans, Black, white. There's a very, very diverse set of communities in that sort of Gulf Coast region, New Orleans and down. There have been some very interesting projects and questions being opened up down there in the wake of these storms, especially Ida. I mean, this is an area that was hit by a Hurricane Katrina, so it was like the testing ground for the Anthropocene, catastrophe zone, right? Where, government doesn't come fast enough. People are dying outside of the Superdome, right? They're dying on the roofs. They're trying to get, whatever. And then you had a massive mutual aid experiment that at the time was kind of tied a little bit more to like, political leftist kind of anarchist subculture. But a decade and a half later, there are a lot of people of all backgrounds asking the question of what would it look like to reclaim this territory that has a deep history, multiple deep cultural histories, and what would it look like to reclaim this area together, to coordinate for disaster preparedness and relief together, infrastructurally, socially, and so on, to help each other rather than relying on FEMA, which doesn't come, or maybe will at one point soon call this a no relief area, right? An unresilient area, right? And what does that look like? But then also, what would it look like to not just be like a disaster preparedness network, but to actually create a territory rich in culture, rich in life, rich in solidarity and sociality, with the means to be free in that sense down there. And that's a vision that people are talking a lot about there and exploring through various means. I mean, and it's an embryonic effort, but I do think that that's a very powerful possible trajectory in that area, and that could be like a model for other areas too, where people are desiring that kind of thing. Yeah, but the tools and the forms of organization, they have to be worked out, and I don't know what they will be exactly.
See, Ellen has a hand up. I think
Yeah, so Ellen has 2 questions that she'd like to ask you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Yeah, super interesting. I was just trying to make sure that I understood properly. So with this loop, it kind of sounds like something that, you know, any system or all systems and civilizations will go through this kind of process of exploitation and then collapse and then rebuilding. Is the argument that eventually we can get out of that somehow, or is it just a matter of unsticking yourself from this particular loop and then starting a new one? Are there like different possibilities or models that you know of for other ways of existing, or is it just you keep repeating that?
That's a super good question. Yeah, right. So it's like, do you accept that this, you know, way of looking at the world as a set of systems is acceptable? Like, do we accept that way of seeing the world is a first question, right? If so, then okay, yeah, then maybe then the task becomes creating other systems or loops that would, you know, be more desirable, more, you know, less destructive, less oppressive, what have you, right? That could be one way of thinking about it. But if you think, well, I don't accept in the first place this sort of implicit ontology that everything's a system, right? If you are critical of a cybernetic view of the world, for example, or a systems thinking view of the world, and you see that as just like actually a situated, you know, way of framing reality that's only one amongst others, right? Then you might say, yeah, maybe the task is not only then to get out of that this historical, you know, loop of neoliberalism, let's call it for shorthand, but in order to build another loop, but instead maybe it's getting out of loops and systems in general, right? If we think that, you know, and I do think that, you know, we live in a cybernetic society, or, you know, under regimes of government that are cybernetic in nature and have been, you know, shifting towards that modality for some decades now, eco-cybernetic, we might say too, then yeah, then maybe the task is double, right? To try to leave that way of, you know, thinking about reality and shaping reality as well. If you say the world is not a system, it's, you know, can't be reduced to a system. It can't be reduced to a series of feedbacks and information and so on. Then the question becomes, well, then what kind of forms make sense?
Can you, just before Ellen asks the second question, can you just explain a little bit more what you mean by eco-cybernetic?
Well, I just
with
yeah, I tend to use
logic of cybernetics.
Yeah, I tend to just like use that phrase when I'm thinking about how cities are being sort of rethought and remade. So if we think about cybernetic governance, we think about, you know, a way of understanding and remaking reality so that it's legible in terms of information, and then, you know, change and interaction is the result of feedbacks between you know, feedback of information and feedback between different systems, right? And so that's something that has historically been sort of incorporated into governmental thinking for a while now. I think eco-cybernetics sometimes, because when you see urban resilience approaches to cities like a Miami or a New York, there's this idea that you can, to field the disasters of climate change, you could build soft infrastructures, ecological infrastructures that allow Anthropocene natures in disastrous events like hurricanes, floods, sea rise, or whatever, allow those things in, but like attenuate their input into the city. So it's this exchange, ecological exchange too, that is about, by doing that, how can you maintain the stability of the system itself, of the urban system, right? So instead of putting up a seawall, the logic of an eco-cybernetic approach would be that you allow flooding, but you know, for example, design artificial oyster reefs that break its impact and soften its impact on land. So it's a kind of a exchange of nature, is an exchange that allows for the maintenance of, you know, the broader urban system, something like that.
So you modify, adapt, and maintain that model, right? So Ellen, did you have a second question?
Yeah, just since we're in the art department, I was wondering what you thought about what place art has in this. You know, obviously there's like activist kind of practices and community-based practices, but like more generally, what you thought about that?
Yeah, these are both super good questions. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not an artist. So, you know, I'll just say that. But, and a lot of my friends are, and I do pay attention to what goes on in art, and to some extent. And you know, I think that exactly like you said, there is this kind of activist art that's out there. And there's often, a lot of times when you see art, let's say in Miami, for example, when you see artists doing climate change themed art, it tends to be this sort of like, it's trying to educate, or it's trying to play this sort of pedagogical or instructive role, right? And I think that this is a very limited, you know, scope for what art can be and what it can do, and what it could be in the Anthropocene, or what it could be in a backloop, right? And so I think, to me, you know, I think there's so much more that art could be. It could be so much more impactful. It could be so much more real and of its moment of our time, if it didn't, you know, try to always put itself in that frame of like awareness raising, or, you know, the language that goes well on grants. You know, these things can then shape what gets produced in our world. And it's, you know, it's really weird if we were to like zoom out and like, you know, think about, you know, being an art historian 100 years from now and looking back at this time period and what was produced, you know, and thinking like, wow. And this would be true for academics too. Looking back at what was produced in academia or in art, and to think like, wow, so much of what got produced was actually shaped by like the language and the terms that like you needed to use to get grants, or to keep a job, or to be funded, or whatever, you know. I mean, and that's a strange thing, because I mean, maybe I'm really naive, but I always thought art was, you know, there to kind of break boundaries, and to, you know, to be transgressive, or to, you know, just simply be, right, or to, you know, to express its moment, or, you know, what have you, this more free expression than those limits, you know, can sometimes hem us into, right? So to me, I mean, I guess I feel like I'm always just waiting for what art's gonna do. Is it, you know, when is art gonna be of this time? I guess a little bit. Of course, I don't know everything that's out there, so I'm sure I'm, you know, missing amazing things, and there are amazing things out there. But yeah.
Can I answer that a bit, like Ellen's question? Because I was thinking towards the end when you're talking about rethinking the questions of priority, and how COVID kind of gave people a moment of pause. So it wasn't like business as usual. You know, the big dream around, the big optimistic moment around COVID and the pandemic was that business as usual couldn't carry on. Like this was the pause to business as usual, and then we could reset. So not just in the terms you were saying about the Great Resignation, but we could rethink what we were doing. And it seemed to me that actually that's the dream of critical art, right? So what the kind of practice we try to do at Goldsmiths isn't just sort of like, here I am an artist, you know, making my own work, but I'm kind of trying to open up the possibilities that are available to us. And art practice has that sort of moment of pause, or the moment of reflection, or the moment of suggestion that is otherwise really hard to come to. And it's certainly the dream of academic life, but I've sort of abandoned that dream for a minute because I'm just constantly restructuring the program. But it seems to me that actually art is a thing that people could look to, and artists could do exactly to rethink the back loop in other terms. Then do we just return back to the rule of the tech bros? Although I do think the rule of tech bros is like an exit from the front loop, but just not necessarily the one that we want. So, I mean, yeah, the question is how we imagine our way through the breakdown of the historical institutions, right? and historical ways of being which have relied on the Holocene. So it seems to me that's art's the historically validated place to do those things.
I would just
it's a
add,
question. Yeah. Go ahead, Stephanie.
yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I would just add that one thing I have noticed is that it seems in the art world that there are some interesting examples of people, artists, and thinkers who are sort of saying, you know, the existing institutions are broken, so we're going to abandon them and try to create new ones, where art and culture and thought could open up those pathways like you're describing exactly. And I think that that's a really exciting thing to see. So I always mention this, but the New Models project I think is really interesting in that regard. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's newmodels.io. If you look that up, it's three people. One of them is Carly Busta, who was you know, she had been an editor of, you know, some of these big art magazines, but with two other people. I won't go into great detail on the, you know, their background, but they said, you know, maybe we could, you know, try to create a new model, hence the name, for thinking and for cultural production and cultural collaboration outside of those kind of existing systems. So they kind of like walked away from the legacy world of print media and art institutions and founded this project, which is like it's like a podcast for thinking. It's a website. And then they're trying this new project called Channel, using NFTs and things like this to try to create like a community of different kind of cultural creators. In any case, that is beyond my understanding, the realm of like DAOs and NFTs, but I do find it really interesting. But in any case, I think that that's a really interesting example of trying a back loop approach in the cultural and art realm.
I know Madeline's waiting really patiently, but I also want to mention, because you've asked that, blame Ellen because she asked the art question. But in the book, in the Anthropocene, like your book, can't remember the title, Anthropocene in the back room. Yeah. You the last chapter, towards the end, you're talking about the rapper Chronix. Quite a lot.
He's a reggae singer, but yeah.
Okay, reggae singer. Sorry. Okay, reggae singer. But it seemed to me there that you would. I mean, maybe we'd have to like introduce it a bit more. But it seemed to me there that you were talking about somebody who's working in, say, the cultural space. Certainly, like reggae is just kind of like in the music creative space, who can somehow deal with how to think through, address sort of a back loop through kind of symbolic forms. Can you just elaborate that a little bit as a kind of model maybe for people who kind of trying to think about the things you're raising as creative practitioners?
Totally, yeah. Chronix, the singer from Jamaica, if you guys don't know his music, it's really, really amazing and beautiful. And it's not just reggae. It's, you know, it mixes a lot of different styles, and it's kind of its own unique thing. And I found his work and the things he says and the things he does and the styles he creates and the videos and the images and all this that he creates to be a very, very powerful example of somebody who, you know, he is in his mid-20s. He came up in the sort of generation of people in this world that's kind of falling apart. And he's very aware of that and very explicit that he's aware of that. And he talks all the time about this need to, you know, draw on the traditions around us or draw on the legacies that we have around us while, you know, being of our time, while trying to create from this moment rather than going back to the past, which I think, especially if you're coming from the world of reggae, sometimes there's a, you know, idea that, you know, reggae needs to be a particular type of music, a particular, you know, model from a certain point in history in Jamaica, a political moment, a cultural moment, a music moment. And he's just like this very insistent, you know, sometimes says things that really piss people off because he says, you know, like, you know, I'm of this world and I'm going to create from this world and make something from this. And so he's this very interesting, you know, personality who has, I think, you know, over the last several years been shaping himself, you know, within the legacies of the, you know, the reggae tradition in Jamaica, but also within the world. So he draws on football culture, like casual style, like from the UK, you know, clothing, fashion, Adidas, you know, commercials are something he makes also, or these, not commercials, these like videos for Special, whatever, that have a bit of poetry to them as well. So it's this very interesting example of, you know, kind of using these realms of fashion and even a brand, even a type of music to combine them together to make something new. And, you know, and what I appreciate is that sometimes those might be like seen as like taboo things to make something with, right? It's like, oh, it's just like a fashion or a brand, or, you know, but no, I mean, I think that's where something he's actually, you know, drawing on his own influences and tastes and what have you to create this sort of cultural form that's quite unique, and it doesn't sort of follow existing channels. He tries to refuse that, and I think it's you know, in some ways it's what art and artists do, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of something that I think is sometimes lost.
Do.
What's that?
Should do.
Yeah.
Personally speaking. All right, Madeline, do you want to come in?
Hiya. Yeah, thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I've got a question. It might seem a bit silly, and I don't know if I missed it, but when you know the diagram of the resilience loop, what were those rectangles behind, where it was like, I wrote it down like K, A, R, and then something else?
Well, okay, that is kind of, that would take us like probably a really long time to go deeper into some of this, but those are sectioning off the different parts of this, the adaptive cycle, so you can focus in on them, right? Saying like, you know, we have one area where things might move more quickly or more slowly, what have you, because sometimes in resilience ecology, they will just kind of focus in on those areas to think about, okay, what do you do in that particular area rather than just the loop part? What do you do in that moment of release? Or what do you do in that moment of exploitation and things like that? And there, if you get deeper into the sort of adaptive cycle diagram world, there's a nice one that I didn't include here, but that can be mentally really helpful, which is called the panarchy cycle. And that's where you see these nested sets of adaptive cycles and back loops, like sort of like multi-scalar sets of back loops. And then what they try to visualize there is the multiple speeds at which change can occur, and how a change in one loop can affect other loops and cascade, you know, back and forth across loops at multiple scales. And I think that can be a really useful one to think about where we are now too.
Is it?
Did you say it's called panicky?
Yeah, I'll type it. Yeah.
Is it this one?
No.
Oh, okay. Do you know what page?
If you want, I could show you real quick here. Let's pull one up for you here.
Madeline, the chapter 1 of Stephanie's book like does that diagram in a lot of detail and elaborates it.
Thank you.
It's super clear as well.
Yeah, see, here's like a little one. I'll share my screen with you. You can see this real quick. Oops. Can you see this here?
Yeah, wow. Oh.
Yeah. So this might be a useful one if you're kind of getting into that diagram and thinking about its possibilities. That one can be helpful too. Okay.
Thank you.
I feel like that's the plot line for the Bill and Ted movies as well. So, are there any other questions from people? I've got a couple more, but also like running out of time a bit. So, okay, I'll ask mine maybe as a kind of concluding question, and it's just to go back to resilience, because I think your critique was really good about it, and in a way, I think partly because you know, we're kind of really well indoctrinated to be resilient as a way of dealing with stress. You know, it's around a lot, very locally with the strikes. Certainly, with staff are being told that, you know, to deal with these structural transformations, we need to be resilient. There's a sense in which, well, if you fail to be resilient because you're just sad and depressed about the whole thing, that you not only fail the institution, but you fail yourself because you're not like the actor who can accommodate, adapt, and change, and these kinds of things, all of which seem to be good things, and non-adaptation is understood to be a bad thing. But and also I'm reminded that in the first talk in the series, Jamil Mouawad was saying how with the blast in Beirut, which now wasn't that long ago, but feels a really long time ago given everything else. But I think it was last summer. That with that explosion, Beirutis had always been really proud about being resilient, because like the systems have broken down for a really long time. Since, I mean, the Civil War was the breakdown. There was a kind of way in which some systems around health or education or even transport were, because of roads basically, were put in place, which served the elites. But then everything else was just like a shit show for most of the population. But Beirutis got through it by saying like, we're resilient, and it was a kind of moment of pride. And then with the blast and with COVID and with the kind of collapse of the economy, it was just like, look, this resilience thing doesn't work for us. It's not an adequate basis for how we need to mobilize at this point, right? And there seems to be something what he was saying around what happened in Beirut, but also around how I've seen resilience operate institutionally, where resilience is a kind of way of packaging up institutional or structural breakdown and all the stresses that are involved in that, and dumping it upon the casualties of that breakdown, who then have to kind of somehow bear the burden of all the transformations and the kind of disappearance of, reliable systems, or being able to call upon institutional support and the rest of it, kind of get through that moment in order just to keep the stuff going. So there's something about sort of privatization and individualization, or like reducing the scale of who the resilient actor is, from which the kind of power actors kind of reap the benefits of that, because they kind of maintain the institutions more in their own image than the image of the people that are meant to be served by those institutions. So I mean, I feel like that's probably a kind of, for me, a good critique of resilience, somewhere between yours and what Jamil was saying. I was wondering if there was anything from your study of environmental systems which kind of did the critique of the resilience moment, but somehow found a way through it which didn't, what am I trying to ask? Which kind of didn't repeat that logic, basically, whether there's lessons from other fields than this kind of like bleak neoliberal present, which kind of lets us think through the back loop without having to feel guilty about not being resilient.
Well, I don't think anyone should ever feel guilty about not being resilient, first of all, because I think the idea that we would be guilty for not being resilient is a neoliberal imposition on us, just as you just said so beautifully. Yeah. I mean, this has been a critique of resilience for some time now. This that it's a neoliberal, individualizing, form of rule, and so on. But I think that it has never felt so. That has never felt so extremely true as it has in the last few years. Just the barrage of demands that we be resilient, and the different ways in which the pressures have been on people to be resilient have just been so great. At least in the context of in the United States, speaking from what I have seen. And so and it's actually incredible to see how very, very blatant it is, this sort of, handing down of the effects of the institutions breaking down onto people and asking us to shoulder that for them, right? It's like your boss, your job is destroying you. It's overworking you. You're about to have a heart attack from just stress and whatever. And then they mandate you take, what's that? I know, but then they're going to mandate that you take a mindfulness training, right? So that you can deal with it.
Never read my emails.
Right? But that mindfulness training is going to be extra time that you also have to be there, right? And there's no remote option anymore, right? Anyway, and so this just feeling is just so crazy, right? I mean, on the other hand, I think that there are people who have tried to say like, well, and this is definitely true, resilience can mean anything also for anyone, depending on how we decide to define it or whatever, right? And so this sense that, you know, there are people and communities and places that are super, super proud of their resilience as a cultural thing, as a, you know, as an ethical thing, as a material thing, what have you. I mean, that's definitely the case in Louisiana. You know, part of my family's partially from there, and we spent a lot of time there, and it's very, you know, very much a point of pride, you know, that no one can take from you, right? And I don't think that should be discounted, because it can mean something very, very different, right? There's a difference between the imposed demand that you be resilient to the crises and the stresses and the destruction placed on you by institutions that are themselves breaking down, right? Versus a resilience that might be, you know, a positive ground on which to stand for a people or group or what have you, to be building something completely different for themselves, you know? So I think resilience could be, or this other definition of resilience as a, you know, a people that won't be walked all over in a particular place, or who can't be driven out of that place, right? That sort of, you know, communal sense might be the ground on which you can stand to build a future or a reality or a form of life that would not be beholden to those institutions that are breaking down and destroying you. You know what I mean? So I think that there are different ways we might think about it. And if someone wants to use the word or not, that's totally, like, you know, their call. You know, you could also have totally different words for that, right? But I mean, I think really the lesson from resilience ecology is that when systems break down, a lot becomes possible, right? And it's like these connections across different, you know, species. In the case of, you know, an ecosystem, we're thinking about a forest fire or something like that. The ability to make a habitat in a place where you couldn't have before. The ability for roots to be formed in an environment that they weren't able to before. You know, the ability to, you know, just make those partnerships and collaborations and to meet across barriers gets opened up. And I think that's a really exciting possibility that is there right now for us to explore, because I think it is in exploring those collaborations and, you know, points of meeting and networks across what used to be boundaries, you know, whether those are like expert, non-expert, disciplinary boundaries, identitarian boundaries, whatever. And also to explore those partnerships and those collaborations across those boundaries, because those boundaries are breaking down, whether we're speaking, like you were saying about the imposed racial categories in the United States, or you know, subjective categories or what have you. But I think it's also really important to explore those and to resist the new categories that are trying to be sort of placed on people to try to re-entrench some of those divisions, because I think that's a big thing that we're also seeing in the wake of things like Black Lives Matter and so on. Yeah, so in any case, I think exploring those possibilities, trying things, seeing what works, being experimental, being okay with an experiment failing is really the way forward. Because if we don't try, well, then history will be written by billionaires and governments, you know.
I want to finish on a bad note, but so I will say that what you were just saying a moment ago about sort of going across boundaries, breaking down those kind of historical silos. Again, that seems to me something that art at the moment is very good at, and much better than universities, for example, or think tanks or other factors as well. So it seems like actually art's got quite an important role to play in taking that model rather than the Techbro model. Although I think they're also quite good at breaking boundaries, but I don't want to finish on a bad note. So, and I think that's it. I don't see anybody else asking questions. Maria, is anyone else there? No, okay, I think Maria's kind of left us. All right, so Stephanie, thank you. That was great. That was a really kind of good return to the talks. I think like everything you're saying has got a very local meaning, I think, because of all the strikes and our own institutional collapse, or not collapse isn't quite the right term, changes, demands. But obviously, like you've opened it up at like many levels, and I think there's some kind of really nice things that we have to kind of like reflect on and sort of make our own as well, in terms of how we deal with this kind of back loop moment. So thanks for introducing it and kind of just opening it up in such a great way.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk to you, to meet you, and I wish you guys the best of luck with everything there.
Yeah, we need it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. So the next week's talk is going to be Stephanie Bertrand talking about how art changes by going online, essentially, and the kind of curatorial demand of that. And I'll see you then, if not before. Great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.